news media warned that Islamophobia is, quote, on the rise in France. Meanwhile, politicians and pundits complain of the so-called Muslim problem in France. Abdelali Hajjat and Marwan Mohammed's book, Islamophobie, published in 2016, examines the sociological dimensions of Islamophobia in contemporary French society. The authors argue that many French officials, politicians, journalists, and academics have rejected Islamophobia as a legitimate category of discrimination. Hajjat and Mohammed claim that, quote, the denial of Islamophobia as a new form of racism has been added to the denial of Muslims' right to be in France, unquote. They attempt to construct a history of the concept of Islamophobia, acknowledging its gradual gestation over centuries. However, they focus primarily on political controversies over Islamophobia since the Affaire des Foulards, or veiling controversy, in 1989. The demographic growth of Muslims in France and across Europe, and also projected future growth, has heightened fears of Muslims. As of 2016, France had a population of 8.8% Muslim, among the highest in the European Union. Far-right political parties have advanced a great replacement theory that greatly exaggerates these demographic projections, however. Islamophobic discourses seem to be effective at driving public opinion, however, since surveys show that Europeans greatly overestimate the Muslim populations of their own nations. French citizens, for example, mistakenly believe that 31% of the French population is Muslim, when only about 8% of French people are actually Muslim. Islamophobia became a major issue in the French presidential election of 2022, when Eric Zemmour's Reconquête, or Reconquest Party, questioned Muslim residents' rights to citizenship and openly advanced the far-right Great Replacement theory. Zemmour's ultranationalism utilizes multiple forms of racism to target different minority groups, but most powerfully attacks Muslims using a form of Islamophobia that relies on deep historical constructions of anti-Muslim sentiment based on crusading warfare. Historians have pushed back against Zemmour's ultranationalist historical narratives, but we clearly need to historicize the concept of Islamophobia through a more comprehensive examination of anti-Muslim discourses and practices in French history. So that's what I want to focus on today, is historicizing Islamophobia in early modern France and the Mediterranean. And of course, we need to focus on some of the agents of practice of Islamophobia, not simply on discourses and representations. And I think this is one of the things that's very much lacking in the historical literature overall, is looking at practices of racism in the early modern period. So I focus in my research on Marseille as a place, and on galleys and maritime raiding warfare as a practice that has an important role in shaping the ideas of Islamophobia and its practices. Marseille was a major port, commercial port, but also a major galley raiding warfare port in the early modern period, the most important port on the French Mediterranean. My research looks at sources in the archives in Marseille and Aix-en-Provence, notably in the Archives Municipales, but I also use the Archives Départementales and the Archives de la Chambre de Commerce de Marseille, as well as archives in Paris. The archives for this period are a little tricky. This is a beautiful letter, but many of them are pretty catastrophic in terms of their state of conservation at this point. So it's a challenging type of research to try to look at practices, but it's indeed the government documents, reports of naval officers, of the Admiralty, also of ship captains, both naval and commercial, that allow you to see the practices of slave taking and use of slaves and discourses of enslavability of Muslims being discussed openly. This is a different sort of study of the Mediterranean. I think that the predominant historiography of the Mediterranean focuses on convivencia in the Middle Ages, focuses on connections, connectivity, trading, passing between cultures. All of this suggests that the Mediterranean is a free-flowing place of cultural exchanges. I'm trying to look at the flip side of that, which is seeing that in French practices as well as discourses, the Barbary Coast, as it's referred to, is a place for slave taking, for commercial exploitation. So my broader research looks at latter-day crusading culture and informal empire in the early modern Mediterranean, primarily 16th and the first half of the 17th century. And in terms of my methodologies, I read these sources based on the Race Before Race collective's works. They've hosted a number of conferences and publications now. I've participated in several of these. And recently, the Newberry Library in Chicago hosted a fantastic exhibition on Seeing Race Before Race, which was a global comparative look at medieval and early modern representations, both textual and visual, of the idea of race across different cultures and societies. Really fascinating exhibition, and there's a great catalog from that exhibition that is available from the Newberry Library Press. My focus is try to see what is often unseeable, that is, the galley slaves themselves and the practices surrounding taking slaves and using slaves. There are very few representations of galley slaves before the reign of Louis XIV. And so it's hard to get at these realities other than through the textual production of a practical nature. If we're talking about discourses and practices of slavery, however, in the Mediterranean, we need to look at, in the French case, how French practitioners of raiding war view Turks and Moors as enemies. Here we have a scene of a French galleon facing off against two so-called Barbary corsairs in the Mediterranean. And not all of the battles are like this. Many of them are galleys versus galleys. And a lot of the people who are swept up into slavery are never involved in formal battles. They are fishermen, they're coastal villagers who are taken by galleys in warfare. However they were abducted, these are the sort of descriptions that you see in the written documents on the practice of slavery. You see a slippage between Moors and Turks being described in what I think we can describe as racialized language. These barbarous dogs, rascals, dark Moors, Turks, Saracens, Mohammedans. Often these terms are used side by side. There's a clear slippage between them. Muslims are referred to as demons and infidels of a vile race. Barbary corsairs are described as being inhumane, cruel, and engaging in ravages. So their form of warfare is rejected as being legitimate. They are othered by this language. They're described also as pirates and brigands. They are not seen as naval combatants. They're described as tyrannical. The raiding warfare of Turks and Moors are described as being brigandage. So we have the rage and animosity. There's a lot of emotional language that goes into the descriptions of their raiding warfare on their side. They are the enemy who commits conspiracies and incursions. All of this, of course, is made distinct from what the French naval forces and informal galleys claim that they are doing, which they claim to be defending against piracy, right? So it's anti-piracy. Of course, they're engaged in the same sort of raiding warfare. In terms of the visual representations, here's one of the representations of Ottoman cavalry. So there's still the fear of the terrible Turk that had been articulated ever since the seizure of Constantinople. But there are also lots of depictions of both Turks and Moors that show darker skin tones, and this is there in the descriptions of dark Turks and dark Moors. And given that you have Ottoman Regency governments in North Africa, there's a lot of slippage between who is described as a Turk, who is described as a Moor. These are interchangeable categories that are becoming more and more racialized, in my opinion. And not just in the visual representations, in the texts produced by ordinary practitioners of raiding warfare here too. At the same time, we have a production of the cruelties of tortures in North Africa. This is one of the most famous texts by Pierre Dain, which has really fixed the visual representations of enslavement in North Africa. There is not a parallel one to see what the practices of French slave takers looks like on the other side of the Mediterranean. We have depictions of Algiers, of Tunis, of Tripoli, of other North African sites as sites for piracy. This is how they come across, that they are havens, they're ports for piratical practices. So the Mediterranean that emerges from these types of sources is not the Mediterranean of connectivities. It's a Mediterranean that is violent, that is dangerous, where every voyage is a potential pathway to enslavement. That's a very different view than what we have from most of the visual evidence, which would show that the corsairs of North Africa, they are the pirates, and there aren't pirates on the other side of the Mediterranean. Europeans do not practice piracy. So, the realities of raiding warfare and slave-taking in the Mediterranean world, then, we can see through a new line of historiography. There are a number of people who have been working on this, Julian Weiss and Borghini, Daniel Hirschison, etc. But not very many people have focused on the explicitly French participation in slave-taking in this period. And it's a really fascinating period for it, because before the reign of Louis XIV, you have extensive and expanding French activity in the Mediterranean, as you can get a hint of from this early 17th century map, which is just filled with ships that are extending out from the coast of Provence. Marseille is depicted in this map as a major port, and then along all of the islands, you see the coastal fortifications that are meant to be watchtowers for the threat of pirates coming from North Africa, principally. But the map is populated by all sorts of visual representations of the French naval power, both formal, like this royal galley, which you can see from the royal arms on it, and lots of galleys that are armed by Marseille, by La Ciotat, by Toulon, by the other cities in Provence that are not royal. And so you have an informal naval empire, informal raiding activity that's going on. In addition, we often forget about the French connection with military orders across the Mediterranean, the most famous being the Knights of Malta. French are heavily involved in these organizations, and they too get involved in slave trading and in work of informal empire. At places like the Bastion de France, which is established in the 1550s and 1560s and becomes one of the first pre-colonial, let's say, outposts anywhere in the world. Bastion de France is a very important trading point. It's known for the Compagnie de Corail, or the coral company, that was doing coral fishing there, but they're also taking slaves, trading slaves, and dealing with other forms of economic activity. So Bastion de France becomes one of the first sites of informal empire for France, but it's not through royal patronage. It's through the patronage of ship captains and merchants operating out of Marseille. So Marseille, then, is a major crusading port. The fact that France does not participate in the Battle of Lepanto directly, they do not participate directly in the defense of Malta, has led, I think, historians to ignore the strong presence, more informally, that France was playing, and especially out of places like Marseille. You can see here the arsenal on the south side of the harbor. This is where they built and maintained the royal galleys. But look at the north side. You can see that there are lots of galleys as well as merchant ships that are on the other side, on the north side of the harbor there. Those are not royal. Now, these are the Marseille merchants and also Provençal nobles who are arming their own ships. There are a few vestiges of the arsenal that remain today, but it's hard to see the physical presence of this early modern raiding warfare in today's Marseille. What we do know about Marseille is that it was expanding even further throughout the 17th century, and historians have looked at the late 17th, early 18th century dimensions of this, when Marseille was much more formally part of a naval presence with royal power. So the arsenal that Louis XIV built is much bigger and more powerful. And the galleys, the royal galleys of Louis XIV, that is well known. Historians have looked at this. The sources are much more fragmentary, however, if you look back in the pre-Louis XIV, the first half of the 17th century, or even further back into the 16th century. It's not this sort of presence that is of royal power and has recently been studied by Julian Weiss and Meredith Martin. Okay, so how do we use these sources then to think about the effects of Islamophobia? The Islamophobia is creating a discourse justifying enslavement, but it's very hard to get at the captive bodies of the actual slaves, whether in terms of visual representations or in terms of slave experience. We don't have memoirs of slaves or writings of slaves from this period. So we can only get hints, and often it's through comparison. So I want to bring up one comparison, the port of Livorno in Italy, which was a new free port that's built in the second half of the 16th century and became a very prominent port in the early 17th century, the same time we're talking about. And Livorno was very closely connected with Marseille. They're trading constantly, and also a lot of the French ship captains and Provençal nobles who were engaging in informal empire and in enslavement went on cruises with the Knights of St. Stephen. They were operating from the Tuscan port of Livorno. This is one of the most famous representations in Livorno, or anywhere, of slavery in the early modern period. This is the Quattro Mori statue, which is in Livorno. You still see it there today, and depicts 4 slaves from 4 different parts of the world. They're different historical interpretations of exactly who's trying to be figured there. But you can see some of the same issues of slippages. It's not that North Africans or Sub-Saharan Africans are being visualized as the only type of slaves. In the Mediterranean, there are multiple ethnicities and racial groups that are being targeted for enslavement. Nonetheless, this does not mean that there was no racialization going on. There's clear visual evidence that art historians have looked at here in terms of the representation of the slaves in the Quattro Mori. We also have the written records from Livorno, as well as this lovely map of the Bagno, which becomes a model across the Mediterranean for a barracks facility in which slaves can be kept. So by crossing between the Marseille records and the Livorno records, we can get a broader sense of the experience of enslavement and the processes of racialization going on. We shouldn't believe that racism simply started with the scientific racism, so-called, of the late 18th century and 19th century. We need to see a much longer history of racialization, and what I presented today is just one part of a broader process. It didn't begin it, but there are important changes going on in the 16th century from whatever racialization had been going on in the medieval period. Thank you.